Hi again, my name is Havannah, my pronouns are she, her, hers, and today I'll be presenting part of my thesis titled Reading Mythology and Ocean Bones, Nighttime Tides of MUSE Through Just Memory. Before I begin, I just want to give a content warning for mentions of war and trauma in particular poetry that I'm reading today, and also acknowledge my thesis committee, which consisted of Professor Yunsun Lee, Professor Gonzalez, Professor Luan Dao from UMass Lowell, Professor Chasen, and Professor Irene Mata. So before I get started, there's a lot of groundwork I have to lay, because Bung is a famous poet, but he's also a contemporary poet. He's a queer Vietnamese American poet who wrote this particular collection that was the recipient of the Whiting Award as well as the T.S. Eliot Award. He was recently granted a MacArthur Genius and released a novel titled On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous. I want to begin with my personal motivations behind this project. So my mother is a refugee. She came here in 1985 after the Vietnam War, and I grew up with silences in these stories of migration because of trauma. And because of that, I turned to history and critical refugee studies to find answers and recallings of this history that I never had access to, right? And while these critical refugee studies is truthful and built out of an understanding of colonialism, imperialism, etc., what I didn't find is the answer to the question that I had for myself. How will I remember this war? How do I remember this event in which I have no direct memory of, but still feel its consequences in my everyday life? And it's from here that I make a turn to literature where contradiction is abundant, where fiction is a space to speculate where we have no access to history, in particular, this collection. And then before I jump into my actual theory, I want to recognize that my work potentially reinforces notions of taste that are implicated in my privilege as a student of the academy. It is important then to take a Bourdieuian critique, a Marxist understanding of how class informs notions of taste of my study of Bung's work. French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu finds his ideology in response to the Kantian idea of aesthetic theory that is rooted in a certain level of disinterestedness in art. Kant argues that only when we separate ourselves from our personal biases to our work can we evaluate its aesthetic value. This idea implies that art and artistic critique exists in a world separate from that of capitalistic cultural production. Bourdieu rejects this notion, claiming that the autonomy of art critique is a false narrative. The production of taste is a site that is formed by class and capital. And so what I've hoped to have done with this thesis and the work that I'm presenting today is not to have upheld Vuong as an incredible poet because his mastery of the canon and his allusions to mythology, but rather use his work as a starting point to explore the question of memory in stories and writing of the diaspora. And so this is today's roadmap. I argue that the mythology in Vuong's poetry is a kind of memory, one that is worth reading through Viet Thanh Nguyen, who is a critical refugee studies scholar, his framework of just memory. I'll go over one poem that I read in my thesis titled "In Court I Watched My Father Bring His Cheek to a Beach Dolphin's Wet Back." In the tradition of cultural studies, and in line with Stuart Hall and Paul Gilroy, I think it's important to give a little bit of context for the Vietnam War. I think we all know, basically, that the Vietnam War happened because of the Geneva Accords, in which Vietnam was split into the South and the North at the 17th parallel, the North being led by this communist insurgency, and the South being occupied by the U.S., and representing a kind of democratic Vietnam. After the fall of Saigon in 1975, essentially, what I think is significant about this is that there was this period of refugee exodus, not of just the Vietnamese, but of Laotians and Cambodian folks, to other parts of the world. And these periods of migration are informed by class and different kinds of privileges. So in 1975, people who were involved in the US military, or like were richer Vietnamese folks, were able to go to the US and so have a more benevolent image of this particular nation, while people of later groups, including my mother, have a less benevolent image of the United States because they were left behind for 10 years, essentially. And so with this, all these different groups of refugees who have different memories of war and different memories of this particular nation, it's hard to have a collective memory of war. And from here, I proceed to this framework of just memory that Viet Thanh Nguyen explains. You don't have to read all that. I will summarize it in 3 points here. Just memory is basically this framework that is concerned with these 3 points: the ethics of remembering one's own and remembering others, knowing that memory is produced in the industry of memory that proceeds from the industrialization of memory, and the 3rd point is the one in which I'm most concerned with, which is memory is in service of the identity of the nation. After all, aren't wars fought on behalf of the nation, and memory in service of reimagining war? And I think this is particularly significant around the Vietnam War because when we look at Vietnamese war memorials, the only people mentioned are American soldiers who tended to be white. And so where are the Vietnamese in these particular narratives? How do we humanize refugees when we think about the war and memorialize the war? And so if memory is in service of the identity of a nation, isn't it a kind of mythology? So mythology has its origins in a romantic understanding in the 1830s, according to the Oxford English Dictionary. This is concurrent with the rise of English colonial empire when informed by the poetic myth-making of romantic poets. So like if you think about Kubla Khan by Samuel Coleridge or Endymion by John Keats, like clearly literature informed empire in a lot of ways in the romantic period. Edward Said said this much better than I did in his text, Romantic Orientalism. So if romantic mythology is concerned with upholding the idea of empire, a predecessor of the identity of a nation, then shouldn't it be read through the lens of just memory or mythology as a kind of memory in itself? William claims myth-making in his collection. He says it here. A lot of the poems in Night Sky with Exit Wounds attempt to navigate history through rewriting, or rather recasting of history into a mythology, much in the tradition of our poetic forebears like Homer, Dante, and Milton. And what I think is really interesting about the mythology he mentions here is that there's like a theoretical openness about it, and this is a central question to myth studies or myth theory in general. Like, what exactly is a myth? Eric Gold, in his text Mythical Intentions, he talks about these different theories around myth. Is myth simply an activity of the imagination? And I want to push back on that, asking what separates myth from fiction then? Like, wouldn't all fiction be myth then? Does myth or contemporary myth rely on the knowledge of an accepted mythology? And my question there is, does this rely too much on a canon created in part, again, by the influences of colonialism, imperialism, and empire? And it's in this theoretical openness that I find space to read mythology as a kind of memory. Because memory and mythology are both about looking towards the past. If we think about classic mythology, we think about triumphs of the past. And so mythology is only possible through remembering or memory. Additionally, mythology and memory both find their form in the poetic tradition. So if we think about myth, we think about Homer's Iliad or Odyssey, and we think about memory, we think about perhaps William Wordsworth's Tintern Abbey or Shakespeare's Sonnet 30. That was a lot. Are we all good? Mm-hmm. Sorry, tons of theory. So yeah, I read two particular mythologies in this collection. One, which is a queer mythology that questions the American fabric of desire, one that is rooted in the heteronormative, heteronational, pulling from the work of Yasbri Porar's terrorist assemblages. And the other is the mythology of the father, where the absent figure becomes a cipher for the queer refugee body to explore the anxieties around war and inheritance. In particular, I want to read this poem, which is in Newport. I watched my father lay his cheek to a beach dolphin's wet back. Should I read the poem, or should I let y'all read the poem? Okay. In Newport, I watched my father lay his cheek to a beach dolphin's wet back and close his eyes. His hair the shade of its cracked flesh, his right arm inked with 3 fallen phoenixes, torches marking the lives he had or had not taken. Cradles the pinkish snout, his teeth gleaming like bullets. Huey, tomahawk, semi-automatic, I was static as we sat in the Nissan, watching waves brush over our breaths when he broke for shore, hobbled on his gimped leg. Mustard yellow North Face jacket diminishing toward the gray life smeared into ours. Shrapnel strapped. Bushwhacker. The last time I saw him run like that, he had a hammer in his fist, mother and male link out of reach. America, America rose streetlights flickering on his whiskey lips as we ran, a family screaming down Franklin Avenue. ADD, PTSD, POW, 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 says the sniper. Fuck you, says the father, tracer splashing through palm leaves. Confetti green, how I want you green. Green despite the red, despite the rest, his knees sunk in ink black mud. He guides a ribbon of water to the pulsing blowhole. Okay, okay. AK-47, I am 11 only once as he kneels to gather the wet refugee into his arms. Waves swallowing, his legs. The dolphin's eye gasping like a newborn's mouth, and once more, I'm swinging open the passenger door. I'm running toward a rusting horizon, running out of a country to run out of. I'm chasing my father the way the dead chase after days. And although I'm still too far to hear it, I could tell by the way his neck tilts to one side as if broken that he is singing my favorite song to his empty hands. And so I'm going to read part of my thesis based off of this particular poem. I'm going to start out at a weird place because I do mention another poem in my thesis that y'all don't have context for, so just be aware of that. So this poem presents an impossibility of the father-son relationship as a consequence of war that leaves the father reeling from his trauma and the son fabricating a memory of a youth around violence, trauma, and a possible abandonment. But this father is not just a singular figure, but rather a symbol for something larger, the United States in rescuing refugees after the fall of Saigon. Thus, the potential failed rescue in this poem presents as a critique of the dominant memory of the United States during this time as a humanitarian nation. The poem is a rescue narrative imbued with images of war. As a consequence of this history, the reader is thrown into an exploration of war through the eyes of the son, where the action begins immediately from the title, which begins the poem. As y'all can see here, so the title of the poem actually starts the poem. In Newport, I watched my father lay his cheek to a beach dolphin's back and close his eyes. It's one sentence. Evidently, the speaker suggests that his father is a veteran of war, describing the tattoos on his father's right arm as phoenixes, torches marking the lives he had or had not taken, alluding to men his father chose not to kill, perhaps. An image that appears later in the poem mentions the father dodging a sniper, once again pointing to the history of war in the father's past. BDD, PTSD, POW, pow pow pow, says the sniper, fuck you, says the father, tracers flashing through palm leaves. The imagining on this memory through the eyes of the child is evident by the childlike narration. Either the father or the sniper just says something. The act of shooting is described as saying POW, pow pow pow. The bullets splash through palm leaves. Formally, the poem unfolds in lines that dart from side to side on the page, reminiscent of a body dodging bombs and bullets in conflict. This interpretation of a soldier in conflict is corroborated by the images presented in the poem itself, notably of the father rushing after the beach dolphin on an injured leg. I was static as we sat in the Nissan, watching waves brush over our breaths when he broke for shore, hobbled on his gimp leg, mustard yellow North Face jacket diminishing toward the gray life smeared to ours, shrapnel strapped. Every descriptor in the sequence operates in conversation with war imagery, the breaking shore, the gimp leg, and the color of the father's jacket alluding to a popular weapon of war, mustard gas. The speaker also describes the speaker and his father running after the beach dolphin with similarly conflict-imbued imagery. The last time I saw him run like that, he had a hammer in his fist, mother a nail length out of reach. America, America, row of streetlights flickering on his whiskey lips as we ran, a family screaming down Franklin Avenue. Drawing lines between the rescue he is currently witnessing, domestic violence against his own mother at the hands of his father, alcoholism, and the manifestation of trauma, the speaker demonstrates how violence follows the migrant body. The violence manifests in the home, but also in the memory, one that causes a man to attempt to kill his wife, that describes a father running towards a dying dolphin as similar to a soldier dodging bullets. America is a row of streetlights flickering on my father's whiskey lips. America metaphorically stands in for the conflict of refugee survivorship tied to the United States. America represents the U.S. military intervention that brings this father and son to this particular country. America represents the difficulties of assimilation for the refugee bodies dealing with trauma. America is reflected in the father's alcoholism, or rather to blame for it, as it appears in the whiskey lips. These images operate to communicate the reminders of war are everywhere. Even the act of reviving the dolphin is seen as violent, as the speaker compares affirmation of rescue to an assault rifle. He guides a ribbon of water to the pulsing bullhole. Okay, AK-47. The transformation of OK to AK follows suit with other images of the poem that go from the innocuous to the violent in swift succession. The dolphin's teeth are gleaming like bullets, Huey, tomahawk, semi-automatic. Where an image reminds the speaker of conflict, the description of war objects like helicopters and weaponry interrupt the narrative in spurts, broken by abrupt punctuation. The automatic that stands on its own completes the phrase semi-automatic, but also describes the line that precedes it, an automatic recalling of war triggered by the seemingly naive. This particular recalling of war pulls from the somatic memory of the Vietnam War. From that of films that gained popularity in the 1970s, particularly Apocalypse Now, Full Metal Jacket, as you can see here. In using these images, the speaker suggests that his own memory of war is informed by those of the dominant American consciousness, given his own inability to access these memories because of trauma in his youth. It is from this cinematic understanding of war that we proceed to another kind of reading of this poem, where the father is emblematic of America. In Vietnam War movies, the paternalistic notion of Vietnamese refugees specifically needing to be saved by the U.S. military is a clear motif. Thus, from this understanding, the father can be seen as a symbol for America, and the son not just a single refugee child, but emblematic of all Southern Vietnamese refugees more broadly. The poem proceeds as a narrative of rescue of a beach dolphin, but given this new reading, it is important to ask, who is the figure of rescue? The dolphin holds a significant space in classical mythology in the story of Dionysus, the Greek god of fertility and the son of Zeus and Semele. An incident where Dionysus is captured by pirates who thought he was the son of a king, thus a suitable object for ransom. The Greek god turns himself to a lion. To escape the beast, the pirates jump ship and in doing so assume the form of dolphins. It is from this mythology and the figure of the dolphin in Boone's Wolf that we understand that the mammal may stand for something more than just itself. The weight of rescue grows exponentially with this reality. In fact, the dolphin that the speaker speaker's father rescues appears to be a symbol for the speaker, the son himself. The rescued dolphin shares experiences and resemblances to the son of the father. The dolphin and the father share physical attributes where the shade of its cracked flesh matches the father's hair. This physical connection points to a potential lineage between the father and dolphin from the beginning of the poem. The intimacy in this action and the parallelism in appearance between the dolphin and the father invites the reading that the two are intertwined in ways not yet present. As the speaker recalls the rescue, the connections between the young boy and the dolphin become apparent. I'm beloved only once as he kneels to gather the wet refugee into his arms, waves swallowing his legs, the dolphin's eye, gasping like a newborn's mouth. The dolphin is described as a wet refugee, and both the son and father are refugees. The connection between the subject of rescue and the two figures of the poem becomes more apparent. The comparison between the dolphin's eye and a newborn's mouth cements the interpretation of the son as the dolphin. When the father holds the dolphin as a baby, his own son, the son and the wet refugee are implicated in the same. The implication becomes increasingly clear as the poem ends with the image of the father singing to his empty hands. And although I am still too far to hear, I can tell by the way his neck tilts to one side as if broken that he is singing my favorite song to his empty hands. The image presented of the father tilting his head and singing the speaker's favorite song is the same as that of a father singing a lullaby to his infant son. However, this image is that of an absence, where the child or dolphin should be. In that way, despite the presence of the father in the speaker's memory of youth, there still exists a dissonance. Was the rescue actually a successful one? In one reality where it fails, what does it mean for the father to have lost his son in this war-torn and conflicted rescue? In another, where the dolphin could have returned to the ocean, what does it mean for the son to leave the father? With the knowledge that the son reads as the Vietnamese refugee and the father as the United States, both these potential realities reflect the trauma of rescue, excluded out of dominant war narratives memorialized in film. The failed rescue where the dolphin son is never in the father's arms at all represents the failure of the United States to every refugee, many of which ended up dying under the hands of a communist Vietnam. The other interpretation leaves the dolphin son in the water reminiscent of the death of thousands of refugees who escaped their country as boat people. In either interpretation of this nebulous image, the United States fails to uphold its promise of rescue and its identity as a humanitarian nation. In this myth created by Vuong, this fabricated memory is an unsuccessful rescue that alludes to the refugees left after the fall of Saigon. While American history will document U.S. military efforts to rescue refugees, in reality, many refugees died during migration. What proceeds from this historical reading is that the father represents a paternalistic America, adamant on fighting a war it would lose, and subsequently become responsible for the thousands of lives lost in Southeast Asia. For the father to look into empty arms while the father's son is running out of a country is emblematic of the American bias towards looking at its own history as humanitarian rescuer, when in reality the bodies that are left behind are ignored in the background until Vuong himself writes this memory. Thank you.